Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we're not going to lay out our own theology of marriage. Instead, we're going to do something a little different and break down a really classic and, let's be honest, pretty challenging text on the subject. C.S. Lewis's chapter on Christian marriage in Mere Christianity. You know, it's interesting. Lewis himself was actually pretty reluctant to write it. He felt the Christian view was just deeply unpopular. And because he was unmarried at the time, he was worried he was speaking from, as he put it, secondhand. But he knew that any honest account of Christian morality had to include it. So what's the core of his argument? Well, it turns out that pretty much everything Lewis has to say about Christian marriage flows from one single, really powerful idea.
For Lewis, that biblical phrase, one flesh, isn't just some poetic language. He argues that if you were to translate that into modern English, it would mean a single organism. And this idea, which he pulls directly from the words of Christ, is the absolute foundation for his entire case.
And this is where he really presses the point. He believed this wasn't just a nice thought, not a sentiment. He saw it as a statement of fact about how the, quote, human machine is designed to work, kind of like how a lock and its key are really one mechanism, or a violin and its bow are one instrument.
Now, this idea directly shapes his view on sexual ethics. If a married couple is a single organism, then sex is meant to be part of that complete union. Lewis argues that trying to isolate the sexual part from that total union is, in his words, a monstrosity. The analogy he uses is pretty striking. It's like someone trying to get the pleasure of taste by just chewing food and then spitting it out without ever swallowing. Okay, so if marriage is meant to be this lifelong union, what actually makes it work from day to day? This leads us to Lewis's really practical distinction between two different kinds of love. Lewis makes a clear separation between the feeling of being in love and the action of love. Being in love, that's the exciting, thrilling, explosive feeling that gets it all started. But love, with a capital L, that's what he calls a deep unity, something that's maintained by your will and strengthened by habit. Once the starter, the other's the engine. He describes being in love as that first glorious explosion. It's that powerful feeling that gets a couple to make that promise of fidelity to each other. But he's quick to point out, it is still just a feeling. And as we all know, feelings have a way of coming and going.
And here's the crucial point. You can't promise to feel a certain way forever. It's just not possible. But you can promise to act a certain way. Lewis argues that it's this quieter, willed love that makes it possible for people to keep the promise they made back when that initial explosion happened. This is the fuel the marriage actually runs on for the long haul.
All right, let's circle back to that single organism idea for a minute. Because if Lewis is right about that, then it has some really serious consequences for how we ought to think about divorce. Lewis points out that while different churches might disagree on whether divorce is ever allowed, they all agree on what it is. They see it as something like cutting up a living body, a kind of surgical operation. He even says they view it as something more like having both your legs cut off than just dissolving a business partnership. He puts this in stark contrast with what he calls the modern view, seeing divorce as just a simple readjustment of partners that you do whenever that feeling of being in love disappears. So you can see the two perspectives. One sees a violent act against a living thing. The other just sees a change of heart. Okay, now we're getting to what is, for a lot of modern readers, the most difficult part of Lewis's argument, the whole question of headship. He frames this as a practical, almost constitutional problem that any permanent union has to figure out. The question he puts forward is pretty simple. If two people are bound together for life and they hit a serious disagreement they just cannot resolve, what happens? You can't have a majority vote in a council of two. So if they can't split up, Lewis argues one of them has to have the casting vote. So why the man? Lewis gives a reason that's tied to what he calls the family's foreign policy. He says the wife is the special champion of the family's interests, with an intense family patriotism. The husband's job, he argues, is to be more just to outsiders, so he gets the last word to protect other people from that intense internal focus of the family. And then Lewis adds a second point, which is more of an observation. He suggests that there just seems to be something unnatural about wives ruling husbands. And he argues that even women who are the head of their own house often look down on the men next door who are in that same position. So we've gone through all these strong views. Let's get to the conclusion. What did Lewis think about all this and the law? His take here might actually surprise you. Lewis was incredibly clear that Christians, whether as voters or politicians, should absolutely not try to make divorce difficult for everybody else. His reasoning was pretty straightforward. Why should a non-Christian society be expected to live by Christian rules? He wrote, "I should be very angry if the Mohammedans tried to prevent the rest of us from drinking wine." His solution was to have two completely distinct kinds of marriage. You'd have a civil marriage governed by the state with rules that apply to all citizens. And then you'd have a Christian marriage governed by the church with rules only for its own members. He thought the line between them should be really sharp so everybody would know exactly which was which. And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. In our own time, where faith and public policy seem to be constantly intersecting, Lewis's argument for separating church and state rules on marriage is pretty challenging, isn't it? It really makes you wonder, how does an idea like that fit into our public debates today?